The video begins with a somber and emotionally charged sequence. Black and white photos of young Indigenous children dressed in unfamiliar uniforms, standing in rows at residential schools. Faded images of crumbling school buildings, lonely graveyards, and abandoned shoes at memorial sites set a haunting tone. The narration cuts through in a quiet, reflective voice. For over a century, Indigenous children were taken from their homes, stripped of their language, culture, and families, in a system designed not to educate, but to erase. This chilling truth immediately draws the viewer into the gravity of the subject. The hook quickly follows, framed as a question that carries into the present day. Why does this chapter, often hidden or downplayed, still shape our world today? It establishes that the legacy of residential schools isn't locked in the past. It lives on through generational trauma, broken treaties, and ongoing efforts toward truth and reconciliation. The intro wraps up by setting a clear roadmap for the viewer. The video will uncover the origins of the residential school system, the lived experiences of children, the systemic abuse they endured, the long-term effects on communities, and why Canada's path to reconciliation cannot ignore this history. It promises hard truths, difficult questions, and a deeper understanding of how colonial policies tried to sever Indigenous identity and how Indigenous peoples continue to fight for healing and justice. European colonization of what is now Canada brought with it not only settlers, but also missionaries and a colonial worldview rooted in the belief that European culture, religion, and governance were inherently superior. From the outset, Indigenous peoples were seen not as sovereign nations with their own systems of knowledge, but as obstacles to expansion, to be converted, assimilated, or removed. Missionaries were among the first to push for the education of Indigenous children in European ways, often under the guise of salvation. They believed that removing children from their families and communities was the only way to save them from what they saw as a primitive lifestyle. These early religious efforts laid the groundwork for a much more organized and destructive system to come. In the late 19th century, the Canadian government formally partnered with Christian churches, primarily the Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, and United Churches, to establish a nationwide network of residential schools. These were not simply educational institutions. They were part of a deliberate policy of cultural genocide. The government's stated goal was to kill the Indian in the child, a phrase that echoed through official documents and speeches of the time. Duncan Campbell Scott's words weren't just a reflection of one man's prejudice. They were a formal policy position of the Canadian government. His statement pulled back the veil on the true motivations behind the residential school system. This wasn't about integration or education in any benevolent sense. It was about elimination. The systematic erasure of Indigenous nations by targeting their youngest and most vulnerable. By saying he wanted to get rid of the Indian problem, Scott framed Indigenous existence itself as a problem to be solved, not through negotiation or respect, but through assimilation so complete that Indigenous people would cease to exist as distinct cultures. The phrase absorbed into the body politic sounds bureaucratic, but its implications are violent. It means stripping away identity, sovereignty, tradition, and replacing them with the norms of the colonial state. This was not integration with dignity. It was a forced disappearance. The residential schools became the primary instrument of this policy. Children as young as 4 were taken, often forcibly from their homes. Parents were threatened with arrest or denied essential resources if they resisted. Once at school, children were forbidden from speaking their language or practicing their traditions. They were given European names, forced into uniforms, and subjected to harsh discipline. Abuse was rampant, physical, emotional, and sexual. Loneliness, fear, and trauma became the defining features of their childhood. This system operated for over a century, affecting more than 150,000 Indigenous children across Canada. The intergenerational consequences have been profound. Languages were lost. Cultural transmission was interrupted. Entire communities were left grappling with the trauma and disconnection inflicted by these institutions. Scott's words are now widely cited because they capture the cold, calculated nature of the residential school policy, not as a misguided attempt at education, but as an intentional act of cultural destruction. It was, in the words of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a cultural genocide, one that Canada is still reckoning with today. Life inside Canada's residential schools was defined by control, deprivation, and trauma. From the moment Indigenous children arrived, often after long, disorienting journeys by train or bus, they were stripped of everything familiar. Their hair was cut short. Their traditional clothes were taken. They were given new names, usually English or Christian, ones and assigned numbers as if their identities needed to be erased and replaced. The daily routine was rigid and militaristic. Days began early with prayers or hymns, followed by long hours of chores and minimal academic instruction. Education, when offered, was often inferior and designed to train children for low-status labor, farming for boys, domestic service for girls. Discipline was harsh and unforgiving. Children who spoke their Indigenous language were beaten, humiliated, or forced to wear signs that labeled them as disobedient. Any act of cultural expression, be it a word in their native tongue, a gesture, a song, was seen as defiance. Uniformity and obedience were the ultimate goals. Meals were often inadequate and nutrition poor. Sanitation was minimal. Illnesses spread quickly and medical care was lacking. Many children died of disease, neglect, or abuse, and some never returned home. Unmarked graves, only recently acknowledged in the public eye, are a haunting testament to how disposable Indigenous children were made to feel within these institutions. Survivors recount the constant fear that governed their childhoods. Fear of punishment. Fear of isolation. Fear of forgetting who they were. Many describe the numbness that settled in, the emotional armor children were forced to build just to survive. These stories, shared in voiceovers or solemn interviews, speak of stolen innocence, of deep loneliness, and of the pain of being made to feel ashamed of one's heritage. The psychological scars left by the residential school system were not contained within the walls of those institutions. They followed survivors long after the doors closed. These were not simply bad memories. They were deeply embedded wounds that reshaped entire lives. Many survivors left the schools with broken senses of self, having been taught to be ashamed of who they were, where they came from, and what they believed. For countless individuals, their childhoods were not filled with discovery or play, but with punishment, fear, and forced alienation from their own cultures and families. As they grew into adulthood, the trauma manifested in countless ways. Relationships with family members often became strained or fractured entirely. Parents who had been abused and neglected as children frequently found themselves unprepared or emotionally unequipped to raise their own children with the care and emotional stability they had been denied. The shame and pain turned inward for some, expressed through struggles with substance use, depression, and other mental health challenges. For others, the anger and confusion turned outward, leading to cycles of violence, incarceration, or detachment from community and identity. But what makes the legacy of residential schools even more devastating is how the harm did not stop with those who attended them. Trauma, especially when unaddressed, is passed on. Children of survivors often grew up in homes where pain was present but unspoken, where love was distorted by fear, where cultural knowledge was absent, not by choice, but by theft. This intergenerational trauma means that people who never set foot inside a residential school still carry its emotional, psychological, and cultural impact. This is why understanding what happened inside these schools is not simply about acknowledging a dark chapter in history. It's about recognizing the ongoing consequences of a system designed to erase Indigenous existence. It's about honoring the incredible strength of those who survived and those who are still healing. Survival, in this context, was not just about staying alive. It was about keeping a sense of identity, however fragmented, alive through decades of denial and suppression. And yet, out of this pain has come resistance and resilience. Survivors have shared their stories, breaking the silence that once protected abusers and institutions. Communities have begun reclaiming language, ceremony, and cultural practices once nearly lost. Healing centers, art, education, and activism have become tools for recovery and resistance. Reconciliation, then, cannot be a symbolic gesture. It must begin with listening, truly listening to these stories. And it must be followed by action, implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, ensuring justice, returning land, and supporting cultural revitalization. Because this history is not just something Canada must remember, it's something the country must respond to with accountability, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to never let such crimes happen again. The abuse and neglect that took place in Canada's residential schools was systemic, widespread, and often hidden in plain sight. Children were removed from their homes under the guise of education, but what awaited many of them behind institutional walls was a regime of control, deprivation, and violence. These schools were not places of care. They were often sites of profound suffering. Physical abuse was routine. Children could be beaten for speaking their Indigenous languages, for resisting orders, or even for minor infractions like wetting the bed. Discipline was not about teaching, it was about submission. Many students reported being struck with straps, sticks, or fists, often in front of their peers to serve as a warning. Others were subjected to harsh punishments like isolation, forced labor, or public shaming. Worse still was the reality of sexual abuse. In hundreds of testimonies shared by survivors and documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the stories of sexual assault are tragically common. Many children were victimized by priests, nuns, and staff who faced little to no oversight and who were often transferred rather than punished. The betrayal of trust, especially by figures claiming moral or spiritual authority, inflicted deep, lasting psychological wounds. For many survivors, the shame and trauma of this abuse were carried in silence for decades. Emotional abuse was another insidious form of harm. Children were routinely told that their cultures were inferior, their families were ignorant, and their spiritual beliefs were evil. They were stripped of their names and given numbers. Siblings were separated. Letters from home were censored or not delivered at all. The very core of their identities was under attack, day after day. On top of this, conditions in the schools were often deplorable. Malnutrition was widespread. Children were fed poor quality food and not enough of it. Many suffered from vitamin deficiencies and hunger. Schools were frequently overcrowded, with little attention given to sanitation or basic hygiene. Disease swept through dormitories, tuberculosis, influenza, measles, with deadly consequences. And yet, proper medical care was often withheld or unavailable. In some institutions, children were used in nutritional experiments without consent, a practice as horrifying as it is unimaginable. The neglect was not just physical but institutional. These schools were underfunded and poorly regulated by design. The goal was not to nurture, but to assimilate as cheaply and quickly as possible. The result was a system where children died, often in large numbers. Many were buried in unmarked graves far from home, without their families ever knowing what had happened to them. Recent discoveries across Canada, hundreds of graves near former school sites, have shaken the country's conscience. Yet these revelations only confirm what Indigenous communities have said for generations. Children went to these schools and never came home. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission estimated that at least 4,100 children died in residential schools, though the real number is likely far higher. These were preventable deaths, and in many cases the result of deliberate indifference or outright cruelty. Survivors who have shared their stories, whether in courtrooms, public hearings, or community circles, have done so not just to unburden themselves, but to demand truth, justice, and change. Their voices form a painful but essential archive of what took place in these institutions. Their courage in breaking the silence has helped expose a history long denied by the state and hidden from generations of Canadians. To truly understand the legacy of residential schools, one must confront this abuse and neglect not as isolated incidents, but as part of a deliberate system of cultural genocide. These atrocities were not accidents. They were the predictable outcome of policies rooted in racism, control, and a colonial belief in cultural superiority. Acknowledging this, history is the first step, but it must be followed by meaningful action, because reconciliation without justice is just another form of denial. The legacy of Canada's residential school system did not end with the last school's closure. It echoes through generations of Indigenous families, communities, and nations. The most enduring impact is intergenerational trauma, a psychological and emotional inheritance of pain passed from survivors to their children, grandchildren, and beyond. This trauma isn't always expressed in words. Sometimes it surfaces as silence, addiction, disconnection, or mistrust, symptoms of a deeper wound caused by decades of cultural dislocation, abuse, and neglect. For many survivors, parenting became a painful paradox. How do you nurture when you were never nurtured? How do you teach love when your childhood was defined by punishment? Many children of survivors grew up in homes where affection was scarce or emotions were suppressed, not out of cruelty, but because their parents had never been shown how to express those things themselves. The trauma became a cycle, reinforced by poverty, discrimination, and continued state interference in Indigenous families. A massive loss of language and identity also came as a direct result of residential schooling. Language is not just a tool for communication, it's the vessel of worldview, cultural values, and community memory. When children were punished for speaking their native languages, they internalized the idea that their culture was shameful. Many grew up unable to communicate with elders or understand traditional stories and ceremonies. This language loss severed the connection to heritage and fractured the line of cultural transmission. Some Indigenous languages are now critically endangered because of these assimilation policies. Along with language, traditional knowledge systems, how to live on the land, how to conduct ceremonies, how to govern according to Indigenous laws were deliberately disrupted. Children taken from their communities were denied access to teachings that had been passed down for thousands of years. This erosion of knowledge wasn't incidental. It was central to the colonial project. The aim was to replace Indigenous ways of being with settler norms, to erase not just individuals but entire systems of belief, governance, and survival. The effects of this cultural devastation are still visible today in continued systemic disadvantages faced by Indigenous peoples. Higher rates of poverty, incarceration, suicide, and chronic illness are not the result of cultural failure. They are the fallout of colonial violence. Many Indigenous communities still struggle for access to clean, drinking water, equitable education, and adequate housing. And even today, Indigenous children are overrepresented in the foster care system, a painful reminder of how the state continues to separate Indigenous families under different justifications. Residential schools were not isolated institutions. They were part of a broader system of dispossession and marginalization that continues to shape the lives of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The trauma they inflicted has been compounded by generations of government inaction, broken promises, and ongoing racism. Yet, despite all this, the story is not one of defeat. Survivors and their descendants are leading movements to reclaim language, rebuild traditions, and restore their nation's sovereignty. Elders are teaching, youth are organizing, and communities are healing. The scars may never fully fade, but the strength of those who carry them is undeniable. To understand this legacy is to recognize that reconciliation cannot be symbolic. It must address not just the past, but the present conditions Indigenous peoples face. It means investing in Indigenous-led healing, returning land, honoring treaties, and ensuring that this history is never ignored again. Because the legacy of residential schools is not over, and neither is the responsibility to make it right. Even in the darkest chapters of the residential school era, Indigenous resistance never ceased. Families tried to hide their children. Some fled into the bush to avoid agents and authorities, and many communities resisted enrollment altogether, despite the threat of jail, loss of rations, or other penalties. Their love and determination stood in sharp contrast to the cruelty of the system. Though the odds were stacked against them, Indigenous parents and leaders fought to protect their children and preserve their ways of life. Over time, the survivors of residential schools became the most powerful advocates for truth. They began sharing their stories, many after decades of silence, bringing light to the horrors they had endured. These testimonies became the heart of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, launched in 2008 as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. The TRC traveled across the country, collecting more than 6,000 survivor statements, each one a testament to resilience and a demand for acknowledgement. Through these voices, Canadians and the world began to understand the true scale and intent of the residential school system. Survivors didn't just share memories, they issued a call to action. Their stories fueled the TRC's 94 calls to action, which laid out concrete steps for reconciliation, from child welfare reform to education, health, and justice. These calls are not symbolic gestures. They are a roadmap toward repairing trust and restoring dignity to Indigenous communities. But resistance didn't stop with storytelling. Indigenous peoples across the country continue to advocate for justice, demanding the return of land, pressing for accountability from religious institutions and the federal government, and fighting to ensure that the legacy of residential schools is taught in every classroom. They are building cultural centers, revitalizing languages, and creating spaces for intergenerational healing. Crucially, these movements are not asking for pity. They are demanding justice and recognition. They are reclaiming their right to define their identities, tell their own histories, and shape their futures on their own terms. The power of resistance is that it endures. Despite generations of effort to erase them, Indigenous peoples are not only surviving, they are leading. The fight to ensure that what happened in residential schools is never forgotten, and that it never happens again. Their voices have reshaped the national conversation, reminding us all that truth must come before reconciliation, and that justice is a responsibility we all share. In 2008, Canada reached a watershed moment when then Prime Minister Stephen Harper delivered a formal apology on behalf of the federal government for the residential school system. Standing in the House of Commons, he acknowledged the systemic abuse and profound harm caused by the policy of forcibly assimilating Indigenous children. The apology recognized that this was not just a historical wrong, but a living legacy that continued to impact Indigenous communities. This apology was a result of decades of advocacy and the resilience of residential school survivors. It was a significant step, but not the conclusion, because words alone could never repair the damage. That same year, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, was launched, tasked with collecting testimony from survivors and creating a historical record of what occurred within residential schools. The TRC's work was unprecedented in scope. Over the course of 7 years, it heard thousands of survivor testimonies, traveled to remote communities, and reviewed volumes of documents. Its final report, released in 2015, declared that Canada's residential school system amounted to cultural genocide. This powerful term was used to reflect the deliberate and systemic nature of the efforts to destroy Indigenous languages, cultures, family structures, and spiritual practices. The heart of the TRC's legacy lies in its 94 calls to action. Concrete recommendations aimed at addressing the ongoing effects of residential schools and fostering real reconciliation. These calls span numerous sectors, including education, health, justice, and child welfare, and they are designed not just for government, but for all Canadians. Each call to action represents an opportunity to rebuild trust, repair relationships, and create a more equitable future. But while the TRC marked a turning point in public awareness, it also laid bare how much work remains. Many of the 94 calls to action remain incomplete or ignored. Apologies and commissions must be followed by action, funding, and sustained commitment. Reconciliation is not a destination. It's an ongoing process that demands accountability, from institutions and participation from every individual. The TRC helped Canada begin to reckon with its past, but the real measure of its impact lies in whether the country embraces its responsibilities in the present. In recent years, awareness surrounding the legacy of residential schools and the ongoing struggle for reconciliation has gained significant momentum. One of the most visible and impactful initiatives in this regard is Orange Shirt Day, observed every year on September 30th. This day was inspired by the story of Phyllis Webstad, a residential school survivor whose orange shirt, taken from her on her first day at school, became a symbol of the loss of culture and identity that countless Indigenous children experienced. Orange Shirt Day serves as a reminder of the pain caused by the residential school system, while also fostering reflection and discussion about the continued need for healing and reconciliation. In 2021, Canada officially recognized National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th, marking it as a federal holiday. This day is dedicated to honoring the survivors of residential schools, commemorating those who did not survive, and acknowledging the ongoing work of reconciliation across the country. These observances, though important, are just the beginning. The modern reconciliation movement is increasingly driven by Indigenous voices, with survivors, families, and communities leading the charge for change. Indigenous leaders and activists have played a pivotal role in pushing for greater acknowledgement of the residential school legacy, the protection of Indigenous rights, and the decolonization of Canada's history. Their work continues to reshape the conversation, ensuring that the past is never forgotten and that actionable steps toward healing and justice are taken. In the classroom, educational systems are beginning to shift to reflect the true history of Indigenous peoples. Many schools and universities are implementing Indigenous-led curriculum, focused not only on the trauma of residential schools, but also on Indigenous culture, history, and contributions. Public awareness efforts, including documentaries, books, and media, have also increased awareness about the need for systemic change. As viewers, there are several ways to engage and support the ongoing reconciliation process. Here are some actionable steps. Educate yourself and others. Take the time to learn about Indigenous history, the impact of residential schools, and the current challenges facing Indigenous communities. Resources like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report and local Indigenous cultural centers are excellent starting points. Support Indigenous-led initiatives. Whether it's through financial support, volunteering, or amplifying Indigenous voices on social media, it's vital to listen to and support Indigenous communities in their efforts for justice and healing. Participate in awareness days. By participating in Orange Shirt Day or National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, you demonstrate solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Wear orange, attend events, or simply take time to reflect and learn about the history. Advocate for policy changes. Push for governmental and corporate accountability in addressing Indigenous rights, including the implementation of the 94 calls to action from the TRC. Support organizations that are fighting for land rights, justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG, and the protection of cultural heritage. Support Indigenous-owned businesses. Purchasing from Indigenous artists, businesses, and organizations can help provide financial support and empower communities. Reconciliation isn't something that can be achieved overnight. It requires commitment, patience, and the collective effort of all Canadians. By continuing to educate ourselves, support Indigenous-led initiatives, and take meaningful action, we can work toward a future of justice, healing, and understanding. As we reflect on the painful history of Canada's residential schools, we are reminded of the enduring strength of Indigenous communities and the resilience of those who survived. The trauma inflicted by the system of forced assimilation, the loss of language, culture, and family, and the abuse endured by so many children are all vital parts of our shared history that must never be forgotten. It is not enough to simply acknowledge this past. We must actively work toward healing, understanding, and justice. As we move forward, it's crucial to listen to and amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples, to support their efforts toward reconciliation, and to stand in solidarity as they continue to reclaim their history, culture, and rights. In the words of Terry Nelson, a former residential school student, reconciliation is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process, one that requires the involvement of all Canadians, the effort of all Canadians, and the commitment of all Canadians. Let this be the starting point for all of us. Let's not allow the legacy of the residential schools to be forgotten, but instead, use it as fuel for change toward a more just, equitable, and compassionate future for all. Call to action. Educate yourself. Share what you've learned. Support Indigenous communities in their call for justice. The journey toward reconciliation begins with us today.